you've been in the cognitive science and computer science and psychology field for a very long time now, and that kind of in part makes you some type of historian by experience. And I was just wondering, how has the field of cognitive science specifically evolved from when you started researching into it, and where do you think the future could be now, or not? I don't know, but like in the
When I
future.
started in McGill, behaviorism was already over, and what was at least there was cognitive psychobiology, but they were still doing horrible things, and they still are, in fact. But they still are for biomedical reasons, but for behavioristic reasons that turned out to be useless. Okay, a lot of rats and pigeons and cats and I don't God knows what else were being tortured because of these simplistic behavioristic ideas, the schedules of reinforcement and stuff like that. That was all for nothing. And already Hebb was there. He also had animals tortured, but they were tortured for things like receptive fields. The receptive field stuff came indirectly out of stuff here at McGill. A lot of stuff came from McGill, in this history, and not just because I came from McGill. Not at all because I came from McGill, but not because I'm referencing it to McGill because I know anyway. Pleasure center stuff came from here. A lot of stuff on early behavior. Even we could even say the Darwinian evolutionary psychology already got a start in those early days in the 60s and 70s. And then a new kid came on. Something that really changed things was artificial intelligence, where we stopped blathering about schedule reinforcement and shaping and stuff like that, or even correlates in the brain. But they started building models, some computational and some robotic, that could actually do these things that until then nothing but organisms could do. And not only do them, but knowing how they do them. So you would say, so I would say, and by the way, Turing's paper was in 1950, which was
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I was five. So it was before I was even at McGill. So it was in the air. But these people were starting to put Turing's stuff into practice badly in the beginning. It was a lot of computationalism. And the next landmark was really Searle, who put an end to this nonsense that cognition is just computation. Uh, and then neural networks started appearing, also coming from the domain of computation. They were misunderstood. They were described as being an alternative to computation, but they're not. They're a form of computation. Okay, um, and then I think the next, I'm really jumping here, but I think the next landmark, even neural nets for all those years, which were doing clever things, but toy things, T1 type of thing, um, even, even they um, weren't getting anywhere until the godfathers of deep learning, uh, Jeff Hinton, Yoshua Bengio, and Jan LeCun in 2015, quite recently, um, described how it is that they had overcome the limitations of ordinary neural net learning with the multi-layered net and a large number of unsupervised. I should talk about supervised and unsupervised learning because that's a take-home thing. Layers of unsupervised learning, and then higher up supervised learning, uh, which turned out to be much more powerful in the same way that ChatGPT using deep learning and then some and the big gulp, but uh, deep learning itself suddenly broke the boundaries, and it seemed like it could in principle do anything that was learnable. I don't think that's true, but it's a huge chunk of it. It would be silly of Darwin to ignore that particular possibility, just as it would be silly of Darwin to ignore the possibilities that the projective geometry give you in vision. I mean, it would be you would have to use some of those things. So I don't think it's the be all and end all, but it's opened up a new world. And ChatGPT is one of the first symptoms of this new world.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Now, what is unsupervised and supervised learning? Both of them are done by neural nets. The simple version is unsupervised. You want to say it or should I say it?
You can say it. I like it. I
Okay.
like hearing your explanations. They're always super simple.
Okay. So unsupervised learning is a neural network is not a graph. It's a network of nodes interconnected that can activate one another, and they have degrees of activation, and they have connectivity, et cetera, et cetera. The details don't matter. But the perceptron was the first one. I suppose I should have given the perceptron whenever Rosenblatt made the perceptron. That should have gotten credit for the switch to neural nets in the first place. I don't know where it was in that series, but but unsupervised learning, and I should give a discredit to Minsky, never mind. So unsupervised learning is when you have neural nets that are interconnected like this, and they have an input layer and an output layer, and they're able to produce at the output layer the same thing that they got at the input layer, copy it. Okay, I mean they have to learn that, but they learn to do it. And while they're learning, you have it could be a sentence, it could be a pattern, anything, and it gives you the same thing on the other end. But the way they do it, unsupervised, now there's no training, no, you're right, you're wrong, etc., is by looking at the correlations between as you produce lots of examples, right? You have to be in a domain. If it's net talk, the way I think net talk was unsupervised, I forget. If let's say you're just giving Slovak sentence, is it Slovak?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you're just giving spoken Slovak sentences, and it's got to repeat them, and in the process it gets better and better. In the beginning, it's garbled, but as some activations get stronger and some get weaker, there is a hidden bit of well, never mind. I don't want to complicate it. By doing it over and over again, some activations will be strengthened and others won't. And they'll be strengthened by the fact that in the stream of Slovak words, there would be certain combinations that occur often and others that don't occur or rarely. So it'll learn it learns a kind of classification. It learns in connection space to put together the things that tend to have the same features and separate them from the things that tend to have different features. That's not categorization yet, because somebody could come in and say, look, that has nothing to do with what it is that the sentence means, and I'm going to train you on meaning, and then you can throw out all of those unsupervised correlations. But it can be useful. It can be, for example, the example I used in class is because if you look at a landscape, you can see, if you look at landscapes in different countries over and over again, you can't help see that there's some convexities, things that go up like that and down, and concavities, which are, I'm going to activate the hand thing, but the concavities go down like this. So mountain valley are there. You don't know what mountains are. You don't know what valleys are. You're not giving any feedback, but you do see that mountains tend to have white tops. And I mean, convex shapes tend to have white tops, and concave shapes tend to have see-through tops. Let's say bottoms. Let's say like lake. That correlation will be picked up by unsupervised learning. And if it's the only thing you need to know in the world, you're already there. It becomes serious when you're not already there, where you can put in all the stuff, but you still don't know what a mountain is. You don't know what a valley is. You don't know what a zebra is. They're all there in the landscape, but you need to pick them out. That's when you need supervised learning. Supervised learning is where you get an input. Maybe unsupervised learning makes you give a certain output, but then you get feedback, and then this famous backpropagation. You get feedback, and the connections that are there and the activations, if they led to a correct response, you did the right thing, are slightly strengthened. And if they led you to the wrong response, they're slightly weakened. And that's repeated over and over again. Backpropagation is the algorithm that traces back all of the activation trails that got you to where you are and strengthens the ones that were right and weakens the ones that were wrong. That's an algorithm. It's done in two different ways in supervised learning. It can be done as reinforcement learning. You can say that when the awful people here were doing race reinforcement training on pigeons and on rats and on mice, and starving them and giving them food if they do one thing and giving them nothing if they do another one. That's reinforcement learning, except the behaviors didn't know what was going on. There's no explanation of how it. You give them a reward and they do it, and you give them punishment and they stop doing it. In these nets, we see that you can have a mechanism that works that way. That's supervised learning. But when you're doing it with a computer, you don't do it the way you do it with animals. You don't do it serially by reinforcement, but you take up it's computation. So you take a whole bunch of inputs and you pair them already with their correct output. And if the net, and then you run the computation, if the net gives the wrong output, you do back propagation all at once in batch, not serially as in reinforcement learning, but they're both reinforcement learning. This one is done one trial at a time, and the other one is done all at the same time. That changed the world. And ChatGPT is part of the way it's changed it. And these are landmarks, even though the course was spent criticizing computation, these are landmarks in computation and in algorithms, not in psychology experiments. More progress was being made in psychology, not evolutionary psychology, but in comparative psychology. We're learning, and that's important for me again as a vegan, that we were deceiving ourselves. Not only are we savagely brutalizing and cruelly hurting mammals and other vertebrates that are sentient, and even invertebrates that are sentient. It turns out that octopuses are sentient. They feel. Sentient just means feel. I don't want to use a weasel word like consciousness, awareness, subjectivity, blah, blah, blah. They feel. Well, it turns out that lots of invertebrates feel as well. And so there's reason to change. The most urgent thing is to stop eating mammals and birds, obviously, and the obvious invertebrates, because we don't need to. Because good news, plants don't feel. I don't edit behavioral and brain sciences anymore, but I edit a journal called Animal Sentience. And just this year, just now, there's a multiple peer commentary on whether plants can feel. And some people are arguing that they can, but it's turning out that no, but they can't. But surprisingly, they can do a lot of things. A lot of things that used to only require feeling creatures to do, but apparently can be done by non-feeling creatures. It's a little bit analogous to the way that the first artificial intelligence candidates were doing things that until now could only be done by sentient human beings. Okay, so those are the landmarks for me. I've probably left out others. I'm getting tired.
That's okay. I was about to say this is a good place to stop. And before we stop everything, do you have anything to promote by any chance, like a book or something along those lines?
No. I'll tell you, I can give you, there is a series. In fact, you should do this. There's a series of guest lectures on Zoom. It's going to start this Thursday. It's going to go for a year on ChatGPT grounding and cognition. You want me to put it
Yes, please.
in the chat?
Yeah, we can do that.
Or no, you know what? I'll send you an email.
Okay.
I'll send you an email of the actual program for the autumn session and with the Zoom connections. Okay.
And when you say for a year, is that like a semester or like for 52 weeks?
It'll be 2 semesters.
Okay.
I'm working on the winter one. Rob Goldstone's going to be talking the winter one, for example.
Oh,
Dave
awesome.
Chalmers will be in. Dave Chalmers will be in this one. You know who that is? He's he's the author of the name, not the concept, but the name of the hard problem.
Oh yes. That rings a bell. Yeah, I haven't read his book, but yeah, I know who he is now. I remember.
And we've already had one of the godfathers of neural nets, Bengio, last year.
Mm-hmm.
I'll be giving a talk about ChatGPT's implications for cognition in his series, but I want to invite him back here now because I want to invite him back. And Hinton flatly refused. He's maybe the main godfather because he profoundly disagrees with me. He's angry with me for not believing the ChatGPT understands.
Interesting. Interesting. That goes in line with your misunderstanding of the simple grounding problem very squarely, actually.
Yeah, but he's not a Lilliputian. He's a
Lilliputian.
pretty he's a I used to talk about giants and pygmies, and then I
Mm-hmm.
was told that pygmies was racist, so now I say giants and Lilliputians. I don't think I'm not sure that Jeff Turing is a giant. Uh, ju- uh, um, Hinton and Bengio and Lecan are just very big Lilliputians, but they are very big, and so it's
Okay.
not very big. And there are very few very big Lilliputians today, so